So, really quick, if you ever find yourself in a discussion as a software development engineer with somebody about the systems that you've previously worked on, and you've actually, worked on these systems, seen the source code, and know how they work because you've literally done check-ins and actually helped design that system and architect it. And somebody is on LinkedIn, for example, and telling you that you don't know how they work. My wholehearted recommendation is to go look at that person's LinkedIn profile. And when it shows you that they're not technical at all, explain to them that they are simply a user of the system that you have worked on. There are different scopes, there are different levels. And one of the joys of being a software development engineer is that you understand things better than other people because you have context they don't. They never exit the function. So their world lives inside that scope. But if you're designing the class, the method, the system of the system itself, then, well, you're going to have a much wider scope than simply the local scope of the method or function that they live in. And so, one of the things you have to understand is that there's a lot of people out there who fully believe that they know everything, or because they've done something for many years, that they understand it. And that might be true. They might understand the internals of that function very well. But at the end of the day, they still live in that local scope. They don't have global scope. They don't live outside that class. They don't live outside that method. They don't live outside that library. And they don't understand the scope involved. And so, as a software development engineer, you understand what scope is because you work with it every day, and you understand scope and levels of hierarchy and levels of thinking because it's a fundamental part of our job. And if you don't understand these things, if you don't understand what I'm saying, and you are working in software, then I'm sorry because you're failing. But if you do understand, then you understand that there are different levels of thinking and there are different levels of scope. And so what happens is people get trapped in their scope. And it's important that as developers that we also don't allow ourselves to be trapped in scope. Look at my screen right now. You might think, oh, that's got to be Egypt or something. No, too much water, actually. It's brick and it's actually a grain silo. But levels of scope. You squint your eyes a bit, you never know, right? And so the big issue here is that you have to think about not just the world around you immediately, but levels above that. Okay. There are going to be times in your career as a software development engineer when you're going to encounter people that are experts in their scope, in their world. And it's going to be tempting to tell them that they don't know anything. And that's always untrue. They know that world very well. And it could be a function or method or scope that you're not familiar with. You should do what you can to learn from them and be open to that. But in every case, if somebody comes to you and says, well, the system you designed works this other way, there's a problem there. Because what they're really saying is, my perception of the system is this. Your perception is that. And so there's something to be learned from there. You can learn from the perception of the users that use the system, but that doesn't mean that you are beholden to them. And so, in this particular case, I got into a small debate with a recruiter who told me that applicant tracking systems don't work the way they do. She thinks of them as effectively a Rolodex. And as I've gone over in my prior videos, that is not always true. And trust me, I would be happier if it was always true. But one of the interesting things about this is that that person's profile has been on the recruiting side for a long time. They have been a user of the applicant tracking systems that I have worked on in the past, from the look of it. And it's interesting to see the user's perspective. It also shows me that the person who used these systems wasn't a very advanced user. And so when they claim that something doesn't work a certain way, it's because they didn't have access to that feature set. They weren't enabled for those roles. They weren't given that scope because they weren't trusted with it. And so one of the fun things that recruiters do when they call themselves out like that is they show people that they weren't really trusted by the company that hired them. And so, one of the things you have to understand is that there's two types of recruiters when you're a software development engineer. There are the ones that are full of themselves and know everything. They'll dictate and talk down to you and tell you how things are. Then there's the other ones. They'll let you ask questions. They'll ask questions themselves. They'll make a statement and say, "Hey, this is how I think, this is how it's been for me." And then you'll say, "Oh, well, actually, here's how it is for me." And they'll listen. Those are the ones you really want to work with. And so I have told one of them, the type I don't want to work with, as much today by effectively saying, "Look, your profile says you're not technical. You're not qualified to tell me how the system works. You are a user of the systems I have programmed." At the same time, in the same thread, there's another recruiter. I love her. She's a great person. I watch her videos on YouTube sometimes. And the fact is, I enjoy the fact that the world has her in it because she's a generally good person. And I enjoy Amy's videos. But what I will say is that there needs to be a bigger distinction between the good recruiters and the bad recruiters. And it's easy to tell them apart, but only if you have the scope and you have the experience, because you don't just live in a little world. A lot of software development engineers, they only encounter HR when they're getting hired and when they're getting fired, or maybe when they're getting a raise or something, right? But the important thing for us as software development engineers is that we consider a wider scope, because we have to consider the people that use the systems we work on. At the end of the day, if the code that we've written doesn't go out to customers and isn't used by them, what is its value? What is the value of code that nobody uses? And so ponder that, because at the end of the day, I believe it to be a fundamental failure that this recruiter doesn't know how these systems work because she wasn't given enough access to be educated in that. Okay. It was a failure of the business that she worked for. It was a failure of her and her career because she didn't learn enough to be trusted by it. And it's sad. And she's a victim, not just of the company she's worked for, but also the world that we're in. And so, as part of that, it's important to understand that any anger you might feel for users is not their fault. They are users of the system. Okay? They don't have the access to learn the internals like we do. We are trusted with that because we are trusted to be fiduciaries. We are trusted to act as fiduciaries with the best of intentions to make systems that are fair, that are reliable, and that do the right thing, not just to protect the users, but to protect the companies that we work for. And so when you encounter a user of the system and they're full of themselves and they don't understand how the system works on the back end or outside of their small scope, don't get angry at them. Don't let that anger out. Don't let that worry out. It's not their fault. It's not your fault. The problem is that they don't have scope. Meanwhile, as a software development engineer, your day is filled with it. Ponder that. It doesn't make you better. It doesn't make them lesser. But it does mean is that you have a greater responsibility to understand and appreciate that they have a lack of context.